Hi, I'm Bill Furlong, and along with my colleague Dr. Mary Crossan, we co-host our podcast, Question of Character, where we answer all of your questions around the Ivy Leader Character Framework. We would like to welcome you to our fourth episode, and we are delighted that you can join us. As a reminder, if this is your first exposure to the Ivy Leader Character Framework, we would really recommend you go back to episodes 1 and 2 of our podcast, where you'll get a real foundational discussion around the concepts and the application of leadership character. And I think that will allow you to get a lot more out of this particular episode. And it'll be a lot more valuable to you as a result. So now I'd like to introduce you to my co-host. She is a distinguished university professor, their highest honor at Western University. She teaches at the Ivy Business School in London, Ontario, in Canada. Her research has been widely published in the world's most prestigious business academic journals. She's the author of several books, including Developing Leadership Character. She is Dr. Mary Crossan. Hi, Mary. How are you?
Great, Bill. Good to be here.
Nice to see you again. And we also have today a very special guest. She is a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, where she completed her Bachelor of Science degree in Exercise Science and Sports Medicine, while also competing in Division I NCAA golf. She's a graduate of Western University, where she completed her master's in kinesiology, and she's continuing her studies at Western and currently undertaking her Ph.D. in kinesiology. She has authored or co-authored a number of papers and articles on leader character, including an influential paper looking at the anatomical underpinnings of character development. She's also the co-developer of the Virtuosity Character Development app. She also happens to be the daughter of my co-host. Welcome, Corey Crossan. How are you, Corey?
Good. I'm excited to be with you guys today.
We're delighted to have you here as well, and we're hoping that you'll be able to come and join us for future episodes as well. So, we have today, I think, a really interesting podcast, and it's again one of those almost foundational episodes. When you're thinking around building the knowledge associated with leadership character, and this is a question that we get all the time, and the question is can you really change character? Isn't it something that you're born with, like your personality? And then it matures in the same way that your physical body matures. You've got a certain eye color, you've got a sort of a predetermined range in terms of things like maybe like height and other things like that. So I think in our discussion today, you'll come to the same position that I think we all have, is that there's plenty of anecdotal and scientific evidence that character can actually change. Because again, we're thinking about character, at the root of it is really, we're just talking about behaviors and we're talking about habits. And those are the kinds of things that there's all kinds of evidence to show that people can develop, either good habits or bad habits, quite frankly. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, to the extent that these habits form part of the character, in particular in your role around leadership, that will either, in terms of good character, it can take an outcome and make it so much better, but also bad character, or sometimes just not the exercise of character at all, can actually result in very bad outcomes. So again, your character, your behaviors have this either leveraging up or leveraging down effect on outcomes, and not just outcomes for you professionally, but personally, and also really getting to the root of your well-being. So Mary, and Corey, let's start here. People often confuse character and personality. They get them mixed up, I think, all the time. Can you spend a few minutes just maybe, clarifying what each one is and then how they're different?
I think the first place to start is that they come from different orientations. So personality theory comes from trying to describe how we are all different. You, me, Corey. The Big Five personality trait theory is one of the major theories that looks at individual differences, but there are other things like gender and race, etc. But the orientation is they are there to describe differences, whereas in the case of character research, it comes from a normative or prescriptive base. It's looking at a set of behaviors that relate to these criteria around what qualifies as something being virtuous. So they come from a very different orientation. And then when we look at that orientation, it also then yields another difference, which is with personality trait theory, it tends to be semi-stable. These traits aren't necessarily interrelated. Whereas with character, we're looking at these behaviors as ones that can be developed, which is, of course, the point of today's session. And when we also look at them, we have described in prior episodes that these character behaviors are also interrelated, which leads to the potential that a virtue can become a vice if not supported by another dimension of character. So, Bill, I think those are some of the big differences. And then I think from a collective standpoint, a lot of our theories around personality traits have then led to implications about how you form teams and groups. And the idea being you complement your weakness with somebody else's strengths and have a lot of diversity within the group around these personality traits. So if you've got a lot of extroverts, you want to balance that with a lot of introverts. That's not the case with character, is that these behaviors reside within an individual, and weaknesses in one individual lead to problems associated with their judgment and decision making. So I'd say those are the big differences, Bill.
Right. And so when people say to us, they ask the question, can character change? And we respond back, yes, it can. If someone said to you, can personality change? I think our answer would be not much. Is that fair?
It's fair. We call personality traits really semi-stable. And the theory, if you actually look at personality traits, you're not actually, not much is devoted to developing a personality trait, because the study of it is trying to understand individual differences. Whereas we take a look at character, there's so much attention that we give to how do you actually develop character.
Right. And as I think, and you may have already mentioned, is that, again, character can be something that we've seen in previous episodes, can be contagious. Whereas I think personality, you've mentioned in the past, personality can be something which, someone expressing, I guess, a particular trait might express it or might activate it in someone else, but the trait would have been there in the first place.
That's right. So trait activation theory is an important theory in the psychological domain, and it's pretty clear that character will be activated quite a bit differently than a personality trait would be activated.
And Corey, if I can bring you into the conversation, some of the discussion we've had in the past is how integrity and character and personality are all related. Can you maybe spend a few moments talking about that?
Yeah, so what's cool is in the integrity dimension of character, you'll find the behavior authenticity. So that's really where you can start to find the connection to personality. And what's really cool about developing the authenticity is it really does allow your personality to come about in the best way possible. And that's actually really the main part, that when we develop our character, my character will develop different from your character because of our personality types and our authenticity. So when we develop our character, we're not just all the same robot, but we have differences because of the authenticity.
Corey, maybe a bit more in depth around this, in particular because this is the work that you've done in terms of not only your master's, but I think where you're heading in terms of your Ph.D. as well, is, we talk about how character can change and how, these habits of behavior can change. But I think we're all familiar that habits of character or changing habits can be, in some cases quite challenging. So it does seem hard to change some of our habits. What are the key principles that you've been finding in terms of people developing their character?
Well, yeah. So, developing and changing habits are always very difficult. And I think it's important to be able to identify some of the reasons that those are difficult. And some of the biggest reasons being external obstacles and external pressures, such as time constraints that we have, that really make it difficult for us to develop those habits. So one of the most obvious constraints is time. And when we're always constrained for time, we don't allow ourselves a lot of time to reflect and therefore be self-aware of what our habits are. So that's one of the big principles. The first principle would be reflection and awareness. So we need to be able to know what we want to change or develop so that we can actually develop those habits. The second would be a belief or a commitment that you can change those habits. So can those behaviors really be changed? Are they too difficult to change? So really being committed to changing those habits. So, and along with that comes a plan, like a commitment plan. And then a third really important principle would be accountability. So not just relying on yourself, but making sure that you put in parameters such as an accountability partner or someone that you can bring along for the ride that helps hold you accountable to your commitments and to your plans. And having chats with them and discussions really enhances your awareness too. So it's a bit cyclical, and each principle kind of helps each other out in that way.
Is that an important part, the idea of being able to look at, the experiences that you've had either yourself or you've seen others undertake in terms of being able to change habits?
Yeah, I think just like being aware of your own habits, being aware of the character and habits in other people will really help you develop your own habits, your own character. And I think really importantly, being aware of your habits over time and other people's habits, it will give you confidence that character can change, whether that's for better or for worse. So taking a look at big obstacles that you've overcome or big obstacles that other people have overcome and looking at that character development should provide confidence that you can also do that.
Are you ever too old to be able to change? Can you get too set in your ways and that it's just that you just can't change enough to make a substantial difference in terms of your outcomes? What do you think of that?
I definitely don't think you're definitely never too old to change, but I think it's important to be patient and keep in mind that the longer you've been doing something, the harder it is to change that. However, I think what's really cool about character development is it really is, it can be a very virtual cycle. So when you make a very small change for in positive direction, you can really see kind of this chain of events really start to get the ball rolling. So even if you're doubting whether you can or can't make the change, whatever it might be, just starting to put in an effort and just seeing those changes kind of speak for themselves.
And I guess that speaks a little bit to this sort of feedback loop. Again, the time for reflection, but also the need for a partner. Because sometimes the changes, especially if they're subtle, you're not really, well, I wonder if my temperance has improved. And when sometimes when the changes are, very slow, you might not see them yourself. And so having a partner becomes very important to give you sort of that objective third-party view as to whether or not my behaviors are actually, and my behaviors are changing and my character is getting stronger in the way that you want.
Bill, that's really important. We've talked about this before, that 85% of us believe we're self-aware and only 15% are, right? And so having somebody who can observe your behaviors is really important. The other thing is that there's this gap. We judge ourselves by our intention and others by their behavior. So when we're trying to understand our behaviors, we think, well, I didn't intend that. But that's really not the benchmark. It is, well, what are the observable behaviors and how has somebody received that? So having that accountability partner, I think, is pretty interesting. And I want to build on a point that Corey has often raised with me is change is occurring. We're always becoming something. And a phrase we often describe as, who am I becoming while I'm busy doing? Even as we age, we could be becoming more entrenched into a virtues and vice problem. And so we're still becoming something. We could be becoming more courageous or less courageous. People with more temperance or less temperance. So I think in the end, what we're trying to pick up here is that there's a language, an approach, a framework, like an anatomy, that allows us to consciously look at developing character.
So Corey, now we maybe have someone they're convinced that character is important. They're convinced that character can change. So what's the process look like? What are some of maybe the barriers that people sort of might run into?
Yeah, so it's definitely not an easy process, but I have found it a very exciting and fulfilling process. When you learn more about your character and you learn about the character in others, it really enhances your ability to navigate through your life and navigate conversations with others, relationships, and really enhances your ability to apply yourself to whatever it is you're doing. So seeing that enhanced performance and day-to-day activity is really encouraging. But like you said, I think it is really important to identify those barriers for yourself. So there's typically external and internal barriers to identify. And some of those external barriers may be looking at your time constraints and how much time you really have to commit to your character development. Also, just being aware of the context that you operate in each day. So at work, at home, what it looks like with your friends. And also, money can also be a big external pressure. So just really being aware of those, I think, is really important to help you customize that character development plan for yourself. And I was just going to talk about the internal barriers that I think are important to identify, which is, I think the whole being knowledgeable on how to develop characters is really important. So, believing that you can develop those character behaviors, but also how do you develop character? And the really cool, exciting thing about this leader character framework is it is a great roadmap to help you develop your character.
Once is it a journey with an end point, and then sort of once you've gotten to a certain level, you kind of go, phew, like a mountain, I've kind of reached that plateau, and so I'm good here? Or does it function and operate a bit differently than that?
That's the exciting part I find about character, is there really is no end goal. There is no ceiling to developing character. It's endless. So, and I actually find the more I've focused on developing my own character, the more I am able to identify room for improvement. So it's exciting that way. And you'll also find that you might think that you're really developing a character dimension quite well, and then all of a sudden you're exposed to a different context and you're like, oh, I'm not as strong as I thought I was in that character dimension, which is sometimes disappointing, but at the same time, it just gives you more data that just tells you where you can improve your character.
So now, what happens if you do stop? You've taken the time and you're undertaking the exercises and you're really working on it, but then at some point you kind of go, I'm good, I'm going to stop here. Do you keep your gains that you've got, or does something else occur instead?
I find it's very similar to exercise. So when you're exercising, you're obviously developing, if whatever you're working on, if you're trying to build bigger biceps and you're developing those biceps, those are going to get bigger. But as you stop, those muscles are going to atrophy. And that's the same thing with your character behaviors. As soon as you stop exercising those, there's no reason that they're going to continue strengthening or even staying where they are. So it's really important to keep being aware and keep exercising those character behaviors.
So, and then, continuing on with the exercise analogy, let's say that you continue to do that same exercise to strengthen your biceps. If you continue doing the exact same exercise over and over again, will your character continue to develop, or do you actually need to throw in different ways to approach it?
Yeah, so like you were saying, like similar to exercise, often you can find plateaus. And so it's really important to identify when you've become, relating it back to the behaviors now, it's important to identify when you've become comfortable with your behaviors, because comfortable, as we all know, does not breed development. So when you've become comfortable with those exercises and behaviors that you've been doing, you need to identify that so that you can stretch yourself and push yourself to make sure that you are moving in a positive direction. And like Mary said earlier, we are always developing, we're always changing. So we want to make sure we're going in the positive direction, because if we're not going in the positive direction, we're most likely going in a negative direction. And
so then it becomes very much like a life choice in a way. In other words, if you've decided you want to become fit, you don't work out for 6 months, get fit, and then say, I'm good, and I can move on to the next thing. It really is a choice to eat healthily, exercise appropriately and regularly and consistently. And character is the same way. It really has something that you've decided that the benefits associated with exercise, or in this case, character development, are such that I just want to make it a permanent part of my life. That strikes me as being the most effective and sustainable way, just like exercise, to make the changes that you want to make.
Yeah, definitely. And with all this talk too about exercise and health, I just also wanted to bring back to one of the barriers that I also see a lot with character development is your health. So when you're not feeling energized or your head's not clear, it's really hard to make room to commit to this character development journey. So really trying to prioritize your health so you're ready to challenge yourself.
That's great, Corey. I mean, I think we've just really touched the surface or scratched the surface here, and there's so much more. And I think so much of the work that you're doing around your PhD thesis. I mean, I'd love to have you back, and we can talk, more in depth about maybe breaking that down even further and having a deeper understanding of some of the elements that go into that. It's so interesting and such an important element of this process. Understanding that process is such an important in developing character in the first place.
Bill, to foreshadow that maybe just slightly, I think Corey's point, I think many of our listeners will know vitality, which is a part of drive, as Corey talked about, if you start to lose your vitality, there's interesting connections between the dimensions of character themselves and how they can help you revive vitality. And I think what Corey was getting at is there are other things outside of the character domain, like your sleep and your nutrition, that are going to undermine and really challenge. We actually know that one of the best ways to challenge character is sleep deprivation, because under those kinds of contexts, we just are really challenged to be patient and calm, etc. So the foreshadow I'd like to make is around the anatomical underpinnings: physiology, affect, behavior, cognition. And in future episodes, we'll talk about how those pieces fit together to support the development of character.
That's fantastic. And Corey, you'll come back and talk to us about that?
Oh yeah, definitely.
So Mary, one more area I'd like to cover is just around this whole idea of core beliefs and how core beliefs, we've touched on it a little bit about, how the belief that character can change is an important element of changing character. But I think it goes deeper than that. Is that right?
It does. And one of the questions in the MBA course that I've taught now for 10 years that focuses on the development of character, one of the first questions that I get, people are really worried. Are you trying to change my values? Are you trying to change my beliefs about something? And we say, no. Your core beliefs and values are whatever they are. You could value your family, you could value money, you could value health, value a lot of different things. You have beliefs, core beliefs about the way the world works. Things like I can trust anybody or I can't trust people. I mean, there are a variety of beliefs, most of which are often very implicit. What we pick up is that with the intentional development of character, sometimes what could be dysfunctional core beliefs can be transformed into something that is more functional for the individual. And an example of this, something a lot of people would be familiar with, are Dweck's concepts of the fixed versus the growth mindset. And there's a lot of core beliefs that would be associated with having a fixed mindset, which means that you're afraid of making mistakes and you look at critique as something that goes directly to who you are. Things look fixed. You don't feel that you can learn in the contrast to a growth mindset where there's openness to learning and you've got this capacity to grow and develop. So we would look at character as mediating the relationship between your context and your core beliefs. And by strengthening this aspect of character, you've got this ability to understand the context, work with the context, but also examine core beliefs that may not be working for you.
Core beliefs really is something when you engage upon a journey of character development is something that will change. It's almost like this. It almost turbocharges in a way the results that you're going to get simply from just changing character alone.
And I think that it also gets you starting to think about, back to what Corey talked about, personality. Why have you become the person that you have? What are the kinds of things that have shaped you? And it's a platform, this relationship then between character and core beliefs, where you begin to start to examine things that were implicit. I recall one executive I worked with who tended to be really hard on other people, and she really didn't understand exactly where that came from. And I can't get into the details of it, but there was a really tragic and difficult circumstance that she had lived through that she had really buried, and for good reason. But that she began to realize as she was looking at developing things like temperance and humility and humanity to support things like her drive and her accountability, she was able to go back and understand what was it that had made her as hard and difficult as she was on other people. And she was then able to use this understanding of character to go back and unpack these life circumstances that led to these core beliefs that, people don't work hard enough, and the people don't understand that the world is a tough place, and life is a lot more difficult, and, live up to those circumstances. Like she had all of these kinds of aspects that were affecting how she operated. And that's just an example then about this relationship between your character and your core beliefs, so that you can begin to understand, how have you become this person? What are the experiences that have shaped you, that have been formative, both positive and negative?
Right. And then you think about the experience that person had, and then as they create this understanding and self-awareness, they can start to lay that baggage down. And that then leads directly into, first of all, a much deeper sense of well-being, that they don't have to carry that burden anymore. And then that has all kinds of ripple effects, again, to their performance, their outcomes, their relationships, and how they live their lives in the world. So, I mean, it's a remarkable journey that people can undertake. Going back again to Corey, talking about it's an exciting venture, and there's so many positive things to justify the investment of time, and including it really as a part of the way you live your life. That's a great example, Mary. Corey, Mary and I were going to now talk about a couple of different examples we've had sort of in our own personal life. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we move to that?
Yeah, so I think that for the listeners out there, having a tangible exercise to take away from this would be really fun for them to do. So being able to identify your dysfunctional and functional core beliefs, and figuring out how you can actually transition those, and looking at the connection between those and character. So the exercise would be identifying one or two dysfunctional beliefs about how you see the world, how you see others or yourself, and also identifying one or two functional beliefs about how you see the world, others, and yourself. And we're really going to focus on those dysfunctional beliefs. And the empowering thing about identifying those dysfunctional beliefs is knowing that that isn't just who you are, but it's likely manifesting because of a weakness in character. So the second part, after you've identified those dysfunctional and functional beliefs, is trying to look at your own character and identifying weaknesses in your character and how those may contribute to those dysfunctional beliefs about the world, others. So, and for example, it could be something as simple as, I think the world is a scary place. And a very obvious connection to that might be a weakness in confidence, or a weakness in transcendence, because you aren't inspired, or you're not optimistic about the world. So just an easy takeaway exercise like that.
So that's a great idea, Corey. Now, just coming back again, as we've talked about in the past a little bit, is that core beliefs, sometimes those are, they're such a deep belief that they're actually they're almost unconscious in a way. How can you raise these core beliefs from something which are almost automatic to something which you begin to articulate?
Yeah, and I think it's great that you asked that, because I think this very exercise will help you do that. Often we kind of operate in the world without identifying why we operate the way that we do. So bringing that awareness to the way that we operate, such as tangibly writing these things down, I think will really bring that concrete awareness of what those things are.
Bill, I'd add one more thing to ways that can help people signal the dysfunctional core beliefs is back to these anatomical systems, and in particular around emotions, is that when you've got negative emotions creeping in, anger, frustration, resentment, around a particular action, that's where you can start to look at a core belief and say, okay, what's going on here? So, for example, Corey's it's a scary place kind of thing is that there would be some negative emotions that would be associated with that. And so it's those negative emotions that you can start to unpack. Conversely, where there's positive emotions like joy, and the ones that arise from gratitude, etc. Those tend to lean a lot on character strengths. But a good place to start to unpack where dysfunction might come from is just tracking any negative emotions that you have and seeing whether or not they lead you down the path of finding some core beliefs that aren't serving you well.
That's fantastic. What a great idea. Mary, maybe now might be a moment to share with our listeners a couple of anecdotes. Maybe you and I can talk a little bit about how using the leader character framework has allowed us to address a particular, I guess, behavior or that really was not serving us well.
Yeah, Bill, for me, I tend to be really strong on things like courage, transcendence, and drive. And it was pretty clear to me in the early days that my temperance was not supporting these other dimensions of character. So one of the things that I embarked on was hot yoga virtually almost every day. And if I relate it back to the points I made earlier about the anatomical underpinnings, physiology, affect, behavior, and cognition, what I was learning is that temperance has a big physiological basis. And for me, it was anchored in breathing, something that I take well outside the yoga room, and how it is that I use that physiological system that then affects cognitive system, it affects affect, and of course affects behavior. The interesting thing, and we often get asked the question, like, what dimension of character should you begin working on? And there are two obvious answers. One is to start with your weakest, and I would say not just dimension, but the particular element within that dimension. But importantly, you really want to start with something that you're curious about. So I happened, in my case, those were well aligned. I was really curious about the role of oxygen as it affects our cognitive function even before I got into character. And so the idea of breathing and how that would affect my temperance became really interesting. But a second learning point out of this is that it really doesn't matter where you start, because what you find out as you develop various behaviors associated with character is you begin to see the implications around other dimensions of character. And so in my case, I was realizing that some of my lack of patience was really coming from weaknesses in humanity, lacking really good empathy and compassion at the deepest levels for how others were experiencing things. And so I might have got frustrated or impatient around something, and I wasn't allowing myself to really understand as well as I could where others were coming from. Or something like humility, where if I ever find myself getting in a position like, I can't believe somebody did that to me, or how could they have said that, it really gets me thinking about my humility and the ego that may be coming into a particular moment in time. And now I'm much more likely to be able to distance myself from that comment. But I would also add that something like transcendence and relying on, in some cases, something that is a strength for me, and remind myself at times where things look really dismal, I may start to be feeling like I don't have the patience and calm, is actually to return to something that can be a strength in order to support me through that and say, hey, you know what, you can handle these kinds of things. There's a way forward, and you'll be able to handle this moment.
Right. Now, Mary, you're someone, before you even got into the character work, I mean, you were publishing in the best journals, you were an excellent professor at one of the best business schools in the world. I would argue the best business school in Canada, but we can leave that to a different day. And so how would you say that once you started to take that on, how has it, give us maybe a bit of a sense of you were already operating at a very high level before. What's different now in terms of the level that you operate at, between, before and after the time that you've taken to develop those dimensions?
It has incredible impact. I think one of the things I hadn't realized is because was fortunate to grow up in a very supportive family. My parents, incredibly strong character. So in many ways, I was relying on a lot of character in order to do the things that I had done previously. Now, you're asking about, so now I invest even further in that, and what benefits did I see? Enormous benefits, because things that for which I would call you might have had internal struggle or doubt or question or some stress or anxiety about, what I found around the whole well-being construct is that the performance that I was achieving around things came, I wouldn't call it effortless, but it felt far more effortless than it would have felt previously. I would say that, and one thing we talk about quite a bit is, how do you use a moment of time? How do you experience a moment of time? And I would say that the difference I have today is that I feel that my moments of time have much more depth to them. And so that brings a lot of efficiency and effectiveness around what it is that I do, regardless of what it is. And I think a huge important facet is in my relationships, for sure, with my family, my kids, my husband, my friends. I think that having that strength of character and working on it helps you also support others and allows others to support you better. So that many important implications for me.
The example I'd like to talk about a little bit is the idea of, the whole idea of public speaking. And I really disliked speaking in public, and I had to do it all the time with some of the roles that I've had. And almost the moment I actually took an engagement on, I'd be fretting about it, and it might be 6 months later, and I'd still be thinking about it. And the amount of effort and time I put into a 20-minute presentation or a 40-minute presentation was almost like a half an hour or hour for every moment that I had. So again, all this anxiety and this effort, and I would practice some of these presentations, to the point where I'd almost taken myself out of it, and it was, I wouldn't call it robotic, but a lot of me ended up getting lost. And I used to think it was because of the sense of anxiety I had. I used to think it was an issue around courage. So I would take Dale Carnegie courses. I read a bunch of books. I'm an improv student, and so I took improv thinking that, I'm going to try and practice this so much that it just becomes almost second nature to me. And that actually had positive effects, worked to a certain degree, and things got better certainly. But there still wasn't that sense of fluidity and me that I wanted in these presentations. And I remember I was talking to you about it one day, and we were heading into, I think, a big presentation in Ottawa in front of a pretty high-level group of civil servants in Ottawa. And we were talking about a few things like around that, and I just explained it to you that I'm thinking about this from a courage perspective, and you go, I don't think so. I think it actually has more to do around humility, and specifically the idea of being vulnerable. And right away that began to ring true, because I hate vulnerability. I was raised sort of in all boys schools. I spent more than 20 years working on trading floors, where in both of those environments you spend almost all of your time trying to hide your weakness. And I mean, to the extent you actually expose it, it immediately gets exploited. And so it's just something that I've just sort of grown, going back to what Corey had talked before. It's just one of those things that it's a habit, a deeply ingrained habit that was almost in some ways a survival mechanism. And the idea being that I didn't want to be seen to make a mistake, because if I make a mistake, then I'll look weak. And if I look weak, like at an all-boys school or on a trading floor, you'll get attacked. And just speaking about core beliefs, it's not imagined. I mean, there's reality to that. And so, that and again, the idea of not looking weak can feed into the idea of pride. But I think it had gone beyond that. It had taken something where I want to do a good job, and I want to present myself in a certain way to an excess. It had taken that virtue into a vice. And with all of those issues around performance and anxiety. And so I tried, going into that particular speech, I thought to myself, I gotta take a different approach, and I'm going to be really humble and accept the vulnerability that goes with going on front of, a couple of hundred people, uh, talking about the topic that we're talking about. And I just took a moment and I just began to think to myself the word humble. I'm going to be humble and just accept what the day is going to bring. And I'm not going to try and create sort of anything other than who I am, kind of going back to Corey's comments earlier around authenticity. It's just me. I'm trying my best. I'm really passionate around the work that we do. I'm confident in the quality of the work, and I know it makes a difference in people's lives. And it immediately, that stirrings of anxiety and they just frankly melted away. And that was, I think, one of the better presentations that you and I had given. I felt like we were sort of genuine and authentic. I mean, you always are. And the pressure to perform just it just left me, and it was just, I'm here to do this. And it really I became more open and vulnerable. I began to think of myself in terms of being humble, and becoming more open and vulnerable, becoming less concerned about performance, paradoxically improved my performance. And so I found that to be a way of kind of diagnosing and then prescribing an approach that allowed me to perform much better in something that was really important to me and that frankly had dogged me for years. So I'm not saying that approach will necessarily work for everybody in that context, but I would suggest that, going back to what we've always talked about, take any particular challenge or opportunity and look at through the lens of leadership character, and it's going to provide these insights and these ways of looking at that problem that's different than anything you've done before. And again, with a framework that allows you to intentionally and intelligently sort of change some things. The outcomes for me, Mary, has been like a great sense of well-being. I don't beat myself up anymore about, the anxiety and the stress that I used to go through around public speaking. I think I more effectively communicate. I don't waste the same amount of energy preparing for presentations that I used to. It's opened up all kinds of different opportunities. I still get nervous, but it's a positive nervous energy. And frankly, if I don't have that nervous energy ahead of time, I get a little bit worried. I miss it if it's not there. So for me, that's been a very positive outcome and an example of dealing with something which had, persisted for such a long time, and that applying the framework has really helped me move beyond that. And again, all kinds of positive benefits. The next thing I'd like to talk about, unless you have any comments around that, and I have to thank you again, Mary, for helping me with that. The one last area which I'd like to talk a little bit about is, do you have any anecdotes from the professional work or maybe some of the teaching work that you've done that could provide people with this sense of what it looks like for people when they start to change their character?
Bill, there are so many stories. It's hard. It's like I can't even know where I would start on this one. I think one of the best ways to think about this, first of all, whether it's the MBA course that I've had over 10 years, hundreds of students through that course, executives that I've worked with, which literally number in the thousands, that you consistently hear the message about how this framework and the development of character, in some cases, have really absolutely transformed people's lives. One executive had had a heart attack just prior to being exposed to the leader character work, and she said, this will literally save my life. It was the heart attack, as she described, was self-imposed, and that she could see that there were deficiencies in character that affected things about how she was operating in the world. And so she looked at something like elevating temperance and being able to understand how she was going to strengthen that particular muscle that would help to support the incredible integrity and accountability and drive that she had. So I witness people talking about the fact that they see themselves under tremendous stress and anxiety and seeing character as helping them through those kinds of things. I also see, Bill, people talking to me about the fact that they're in these crucible moments, that they found lots of different kinds of crucible moments. They could be professional or personal. And it's in those moments that they find character. They discover aspects of themselves. They use the framework to say, again, just a little bit like I described earlier, I've got this, I can handle this, and let me think about the kinds of things I need to activate on in order to navigate this particular challenging circumstance. And it is those very circumstances, as Corey described, the ones that get you outside your comfort zone. And sometimes you didn't ask for them, but they got you there, that you develop character. And so I have many people who will talk about how they relied on character through these moments and how their character was also strengthened in these moments.
That's fabulous. I mean, Corey, anything you'd like to add based on what you've heard Mary and I speak about, or anything from your own personal life? Or we can also potentially save that again for a future episode when you join us again.
Not much to add other than I can really relate to your story on public speaking, and I feel like you spoke my exact story as well. So definitely can relate, and can just relate that to so many little obstacles in life too. So yeah, it was nice listening to that.
I think, the evidence I think is overwhelming, anecdotal and otherwise, that we can make these permanent changes to our habits, that character is different than personality. It's as Mary was talking about it, it's a normative. It's what you should be doing that will lead to this improved judgment and this improved well-being. And that we can make changes that will result in our lives, that we have control over that. We can make changes to our lives to achieve those better outcomes. And then by focusing on that, we improve our performance, our well-being, and that the idea of being able to, as Mary just spoke about a moment ago, under all contexts. I mean, it's easy enough to have strong character and great judgment when things are easy. Where it really starts to become extremely valuable is on, in contexts or environments of a high degree of stress or other kinds of impediments to, I guess, to good judgment. And I think in the past we've thought to ourselves, well, we just have to accept that as maybe being part of the human condition. But I think that what we're sharing with you today is you don't have to accept that. And as a matter of fact, knowing that you don't have to accept that is almost in a way creates a responsibility to work to overcome that. And then again, I think we had a couple of different examples today. Imagine what your life will be like in terms of outcomes and relationships and well-being and anxiety, all the positive changes that will occur across all of those dimensions to the extent you've invested in leadership character. And again, this idea of this leveraging cumulative effect of what strong character can do. And trying to avoid either the instances where we're a bystander or where we or others exert, negative or poor character and the poor outcomes that result from that. So I think it's the impact of the work which has made me so passionate about sharing it and understanding it and practicing it. And I think Mary and Corey feel the same way. It's just, there's such enormous potential for positive change. Corey or Mary, anything to add?
I was just going to encourage whoever's listening to, when you're listening to this, don't just leave it at listening, but think about spending 5 minutes after this to reflect and apply what you've listened to and do something with it. So that'd be my quick little addition there.
Bill, I'd just add a slide that we often put up when we're talking with groups about this is this old Cherokee tale. And maybe I'll just read this for the listeners, because I think it really describes this session very well. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. A fight is going on inside me, he said to the boy. It is a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One is evil, he's anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. He continued, the other is good. Is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? And the old Cherokee simply replied, the one you feed. And I think in the end, when we think about this particular episode, is that we're saying there is a choice to feed the development of character. And we hope that we've given some tools, and we will continue to give some tools on how it is that we can all do that.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's a great way to end this episode. So thank you again for joining us today. If you've liked what you've heard, please share with your friends and colleagues. If you really like what you've heard, then please subscribe to our podcast, Question of Character. We also have a website called questionofcharacter.com, where we'll be posting various resources and articles, and in particular, any links to diagrams, schematics, or other items referred to in today's podcast. It's also a place where you can send us comments, thoughts on what you've heard, and any suggestions or questions you have for future shows. We will also post links to the Ian O. Inatowitz Institute for Leadership at the Ivy Business School, where there are even more resources, articles, and information about the Ivy Leader Character Framework. So thank you again for joining us today. And it's goodbye from me and Corey.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
And Mary.
Until next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.